Personne dans ma famille n'a été coureur cycliste. J'ai juste un oncle qui a été joueur de football au Tremont. Et pour moi, c'était, disons, depuis que j'étais gamin, quand on me demandait ce que je voulais faire, eh bien, je disais coureur cycliste. On me disait c'est pas un métier. Et voilà, j'en ai fait un métier. Et je pense que j'ai pas mal réussi non plus.
There is a small village in the Flemish countryside of Belgium, so small that most maps barely give it a dot. Minselkesekum. Cobblestones, quiet farmland, and the kind of silence that only rural Europe seems to hold on to. It was here, on June 17, 1945, just weeks after the guns of the Second World War fell silent across the continent, that a boy named Duard Louis Joseph Merckx was born.
His family was not poor, and this detail matters more than it seems. Many of the cycling legends who came before him, men who turned pedaling into a profession out of desperation, used the bicycle as an escape from hunger. Eddy's father ran a grocery store. There was food on the table. There was stability. Eddy Merckx did not need cycling to survive. He chose it anyway. And that distinction would come to define everything about him. This was never a man who raced out of necessity. He raced because something inside him could not stop. The family soon moved to Woluwe-Saint-Pierre, a suburb of Brussels where the grocery store became the center of a modest, orderly childhood. Young Eddy was by every account a restless boy. He tried football. He tried other sports. Nothing held him the way a bicycle did. He got his first bike at the age of 3 or 4, the kind of detail that sounds like a myth built after the fact. Except that everyone who has traced his life keeps arriving at the same story. The bicycle found him before he ever understood what it would take from him, and what it would give him in return. Belgium in the 1950s was cycling country in the truest sense. It was not simply a sport. It was a language spoken in every cafe, every church square, every Sunday afternoon when the roads filled with amateur races that meant everything to the men who rode them, and the crowds who watched. In a country like this, a boy who loved the bicycle did not stay a secret for long. What almost nobody talks about is the resistance he faced at home. His family, comfortable and practical, did not dream of their son becoming a professional cyclist. They imagined something safer for him, a respectable, middle-class future, an education, a trade. Cycling in that era was brutal on the body and unstable as a livelihood. Riders broke themselves on cobblestones and mountain passes for prize money that could vanish in a single bad season. For a family that already had comfort, watching their son choose a life of pain and uncertainty must have felt at first like watching him throw something away. But Eddy Merckx was not a boy who could be redirected. There was, even then, a hunger in him that the people around him could sense but not quite name. He obtained his amateur racing license and lined up for his very first competitive race in 1961. He finished 6th. It was not a triumph, but it was a beginning, and beginnings rarely announce themselves as anything more than ordinary. What makes this origin story worth telling honestly, not as a highlight reel, but as a real childhood, is that nothing about it guaranteed what would come next. There was no prophecy. There was a boy with a decent home, an unremarkable 6th-place finish, and a stubbornness that his own parents did not fully understand. Everything that made Eddy Merckx the most dominant cyclist who ever lived started here, in a version of himself that was still uncertain, still being doubted by the people who loved him most. By the end of that same year, something shifted. In October 1961, racing in a small town called Petit-Enghien, the boy who had finished 6th in his debut crossed the line first. It was his first victory. Nobody watching that day could have known they were witnessing the first mark on a career that would eventually total in the hundreds of wins. But somewhere in that unremarkable Belgian town, on an unremarkable autumn day, the story of the man who would be nicknamed the Cannibal had quietly begun. If Merckx's first win at Petit-Enghien was a whisper, what followed over the next 3 years was closer to a scream. In 1962, still a teenager, he entered roughly 55 races. He won 23 of them. To put that in perspective, most amateur riders of promise are thrilled to win a handful of races in a season. Merckx was winning nearly half of everything he entered, against grown men with more experience, more physical maturity and, in many cases, far more desperation to win because their futures depended on it.
That same year he captured the Belgian amateur road race title, a result that started to draw serious attention from the tight-knit world of Belgian cycling insiders, the trainers, the team managers, the old racers who had seen 1,000 promising boys come and go, and knew, almost instinctively, which ones were different.
Merckx trained under a former professional rider named Flishen Verwijke, a connection that gave the young rider not just technical polish but something harder to teach. The internal discipline of a man who had lived the sport at its highest level and knew exactly how much it demanded. The 1964 season became the true proving ground. Merckx was selected to represent Belgium at the Tokyo Summer Olympics in the men's road race. He finished 12th, respectable, but not the stuff of legend. What happened later that year mattered far more. At the Uchi Road World Championships, held on French soil, Merckx won the amateur road race outright. He became, at 19 years old, the amateur world champion of cycling. By the time his amateur career ended, the tally read 80 victories. 80 for a rider who had not yet turned professional, who was still technically an amateur competing for the love of the sport and the accumulation of results rather than a salary. This number was already extraordinary.
It was the kind of statistic that made hardened Belgian cycling men lean back in their chairs and reconsider what they thought they knew about talent. But numbers alone rarely tell the human story. And the human story here is one of a young man discovering, race by race, that his body could do things other bodies could not.
Cycling is a sport of suffering. Every rider, amateur or professional, understands pain as a constant companion on the bike. What separated Merckx even in these early years was not that he suffered less. It was that he seemed almost hungry for the suffering, as if the harder a race became, the more alive he felt inside it. There is a temptation, when telling the story of a legend, to skip past the amateur years as a mere prelude, a warm-up act before the real career begins. That would be a mistake here. The 80 amateur victories were not simply practice. They were the construction of an identity. Every sprint won, every breakaway that held, every rival who learned to fear the young man from Wolu St. Pierre. All of it was quietly assembling the rider who would soon terrify the professional peloton. And so, at the close of 1964, Eddy Merckx stood at a threshold. He was the reigning amateur world champion. He had 80 wins to his name and a family that had by now likely stopped hoping he would choose a safer path. Ahead of him lay the world of professional cycling, a world of longer races,
harder rivals, and stakes that could no longer be measured only in trophies, but in livelihoods, reputations, and the brutal economics of a sport where only the strongest survived. He was about to sign his first professional contract, and nobody, not even Merckx himself, could have predicted just how completely he was about to rewrite the record books.
On April 29, 1965, Eddy Merckx signed with Solo Superia, a Belgian professional team built around one of the country's biggest cycling stars, Rik van Looy. For a 20-year-old newcomer, joining a team organized around an established champion was not necessarily a gift. It often meant playing a supporting role, riding in service of another man's ambitions, waiting years for a chance to lead. Many promising riders have had their careers quietly smothered inside team structures that valued hierarchy over raw talent. Merckx did not wait years. He barely waited months. The transition from amateur to professional cycling in the 1960s was brutal in ways that are difficult to appreciate from a modern vantage point. Professional races were longer, the tactics more ruthless, the fields deeper with riders who had already spent a decade learning how to break a man's spirit on a mountain pass or a cobbled sector. Many amateur champions arrived in the professional ranks only to discover, painfully, that they were now merely ordinary.
Merckx discovered something else entirely, that the extraordinary gift that had carried him through 80 amateur victories translated almost seamlessly into the professional arena.
His rise happened fast enough to unsettle the established order of Belgian cycling, a hierarchy that did not always welcome a young rider who refused to know his place. There is a persistent thread in accounts of this period describing tension between Merckx and older, more established figures who resented how quickly he was rewriting expectations. This is a part of the story that gets smoothed over in most retellings. Greatness, when it arrives too early and too completely, rarely gets a warm welcome from those it is about to eclipse. By 1966, still in just his second professional season, Merckx won Milan-San Remo, one of cycling's most prestigious one-day classics, a race spanning nearly 300 kilometers along the Italian Riviera, demanding not just explosive power but the tactical patience to survive hours of grinding racing before the decisive moment. Winning it as a second-year professional was a signal to the entire sport that something unusual had arrived. He would go on to win Milan, San Remo 6 more times across his career, an almost incomprehensible level of domination in a single race. What is often missing from the highlight reel version of Merckx's rise is the psychological weight of becoming, so quickly, a man other riders organized their entire race strategies around. In cycling, when one rider becomes too dangerous, the rest of the field adapts. They mark him, they gang up on him, they try to isolate him from his teammates. Merckx faced this suffocating attention almost from his first professional season onward, and rather than wilting under it, something in him seemed to sharpen. The more the peloton tried to control him, the more determined he became to prove that no coalition of rivals could. By the end of the 1960s, Merckx had already begun accumulating a reputation that went beyond mere winning.
He was starting to be discussed not as a promising young talent, but as something the sport of cycling had perhaps never truly seen before. A rider who did not seem to have a weakness that the other riders could exploit. He could climb, he could sprint, he could time trial.
He could survive the cobblestones of the Northern Classics and the high mountain passes of the Alps and Pyrenees with equal ferocity. The sport was about to give him a nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life, and it was about to discover, in the most painful way possible, just how far his hunger for victory could take him. Every legend needs a name, and Merckx's arrived almost by accident, from the mouth of a child. The story, passed down through decades of cycling folklore, involves the young daughter of one of his teammates. When her father tried to explain why Merckx simply would not allow anyone else, not rivals, not even his own teammates, to win a race, the girl reportedly said that he behaved like a cannibal. The name stuck instantly, and it stuck because it was true. The cannibal was not a nickname invented by a marketing department. It emerged organically from the people closest to him, the ones who watched him refuse, again and again, to let victory slip from his hands even when generosity or tactical patience might have served him better.
The year 1969 is where the legend of the cannibal was truly forged, and it is also where the darkest, least told chapter of his early career unfolded. Merckx entered the Giro d'Italia that year as the dominant favorite, riding brilliantly, wearing the leader's pink jersey, seemingly on his way to a commanding overall victory.
Then, on the morning of June 2, in the coastal town of Savona, news broke that would shake the entire cycling world. Merckx had reportedly tested positive for a banned stimulant following a doping control. He
was expelled from the race instantly, stripped of the leader's jersey he had fought so hard to earn. For a rider who had built his identity on integrity and relentless effort, the accusation was devastating. The circumstances surrounding the Savona positive test have remained murky and disputed for decades. Many within the sport, including rival riders and journalists who covered the race,
voiced suspicions that something about the test result did not add up, that Merckx may have been sabotaged, whether by a rival team desperate to stop his dominance, or by a laboratory error in an era when doping control science was still primitive and inconsistent. Merckx himself always maintained his innocence, and cycling authorities eventually cleared him, though the scar of that public humiliation never fully disappeared from how the era remembered him. What almost nobody discusses honestly is how close this scandal came to derailing everything. A young rider, barely into his professional prime, publicly accused of cheating on the biggest stage of his career, could easily have crumbled under the weight of that shame. Sponsors could have walked away. The Belgian public, fiercely proud of their young champion, could have turned on him. Instead, Merckx did something that revealed the true depth of his character. He channeled the anger and the humiliation into an even more ferocious hunger to prove himself clean and unbeatable. Later that same year, he won the Tour de France for the first time.
And not just the overall general classification, but the points classification, the mountains classification, and the combination classification simultaneously, an achievement so complete it has never been repeated. He also swept the Spring Classics that season, winning Milan, San Remo, the Tour of Flanders, and Liga Bastogne, Liga.
Building toward what would eventually become an unmatched collection of all 5 cycling monuments, the sport's most prestigious one-day races, won not once, but at least twice each across his career. This is the truth rarely told about the birth of the cannibal. It was not born purely from talent and hunger. It was forged, in part, in the fire of public humiliation and a doping scandal that could have ended a lesser man's career before it truly began. Merckx did not just win in 1969. He answered every doubt raised in Savona with a season so overwhelming that it silenced almost every critic who had questioned him. But the psychological cost of that year, the mistrust it planted, the vulnerability it exposed in a rider the public had believed to be untouchable, never fully left him. If 1969 gave the world the cannibal, it also delivered the single most traumatic night of Eddy Merckx's life. One that reshaped his body and his relationship with pain for the rest of his career. And one that rarely gets the attention it deserves in the shorthand version of his legend.
On September 9th, 1969, at the Pierre Tessier Velodrome in Blois, France, Merckx took part in a Journey-paced race, a lucrative but dangerous exhibition event in which a cyclist rides in the slipstream of a small-pace motorcycle, reaching high speeds inches away from a mechanical escort. His pacer that night was a man named Fernand Wamst.
Partway through the race, a rival pairing crashed directly in front of them. There was no time to react. Merckx, Wamst, and a second pacer named Marcel Reverdy were sent crashing violently to the track. Fernand Wamst was killed. Merckx was thrown through the air and landed hard, striking his head, and was knocked unconscious. He spent days in the hospital and was left bedridden for 6 weeks afterward, having suffered serious injuries to both hips and his skull. Sports medicine in 1969 was still primitive by modern standards. The tools for properly diagnosing and rehabilitating an injury like this simply did not exist the way they do today. Merckx returned to racing sooner than his body was truly ready to. The crash left his pelvis and spine misaligned in a way that was never fully corrected. From that night onward, Eddy Merckx rode every single race of the rest of his career, every Tour de France, every classic, every mountain stage, in a state of chronic physical pain. This detail transforms the entire way his subsequent dominance should be understood. The rider who would go on to win the Tour de France 5 times, sweep every major classic, and set the world hour record was doing all of it while carrying a permanent, unresolved injury from a night that killed the man riding beside him. The psychological toll was just as real as the physical one. Merckx would later describe Blois as the worst experience of his entire career, admitting that he came dangerously close to dying that night, and that the accident cost him years of performance because his body, and specifically his back, was never the same afterward. This is not the language of a man simply recounting a bad crash. It is the language of someone who understood, with total clarity, how close he had come to losing everything, his life included.
In a sport that the public often watched only for its glory and rarely for its risk. Out of this trauma came an obsession that followed Merckx for the rest of his riding days, an almost pathological fixation on the precise fit of his bicycle. He became famous, and at times mocked, for constantly adjusting his saddle height, sometimes mid-race.
Chasing a sensation of comfort that Blois had permanently stolen from him. Teammates and mechanics described him waking in the middle of the night, unable to sleep because of the pain, wandering to his garage to tinker with bicycle components in a restless search for relief that never fully arrived. This is perhaps the most human truth buried inside the legend of the cannibal. The man who would eventually be called the greatest cyclist who ever lived spent nearly the entirety of his prime career in physical agony riding through pain that would have ended most careers, while the world watched only the victories and rarely asked what it was costing him to keep winning. Between 1969 and 1972, Eddy Merckx did not merely compete in cycling, he redefined what dominance in the sport was even supposed to look like. During these peak years, he won somewhere around 35% of every race he entered, a statistic so far beyond normal professional standards that specialists studying the sport today consider it almost impossible to replicate.
In part because modern cycling has become far more specialized. Riders now tend to focus either on the explosive one-day classics or on the grueling multi-week stage races, rarely both. Merckx refused that specialization entirely. He wanted to win everything, and for a remarkable stretch of years, he very nearly did. His Tour de France record alone tells an extraordinary story.
He won the general classification 5 times, 1969, 1970, 1971, 1972, and 1974, tying the record held at the time by the great French rider Jacques Anquetil. But the general classification wins only capture part of the picture. In that unprecedented 1969 Tour, his very first appearance in the race, he simultaneously won the points classification, the mountains classification, and the combination classification, a combination of dominance across every competitive category of the race that has never been matched since. Across his career, he accumulated 34 individual stage wins in the Tour de France, a record that stood untouched for decades until sprinter Mark Cavendish finally equaled it in 2021, more than half a century later. But Merckx's ambitions never stopped at the Tour de France. He also won the Giro d'Italia 5 times and the Vuelta a España once, giving him 11 Grand Tour victories across his career, a total that remains, to this day, the most ever achieved by a single rider. He is one of only 3 cyclists in history to have won all 5 of cycling's monument classics,
And the only one to have won every single one of them at least twice. In total, his career victory count reached somewhere around 525 wins across an 18-year career that spanned both his amateur and professional years, a number so large that it has become almost a kind of shorthand within the sport for describing an achievement that borders on the unbelievable.
What makes this stretch of dominance genuinely remarkable, rather than simply a list of statistics, is the context sitting quietly underneath all of it. This was a man riding through chronic pain from the Blas crash, racing against rivals who studied him obsessively looking for any weakness to exploit, and doing so during an era when sports science, nutrition, and recovery techniques were decades behind what elite athletes have access to today. There were no modern power meters calibrating his effort, no advanced recovery protocols, no team of nutritionists managing every calorie. There was simply a man on a bicycle, riding further and harder than anyone believed a human body should be able to, race after race, season after season. Rival riders and journalists of the era have described an almost suffocating sense of inevitability that settled over the peloton whenever Merckx was present. Races were, in a very real sense, being contested for second place, because the assumption, backed by years of overwhelming evidence, was that Merckx would find a way to win.
This psychological dominance, arguably as powerful as his physical dominance, is part of what the phrase "the cannibal" was truly describing. Not simply a rider who won often, but a rider whose mere presence at the start line altered the entire calculus of how a race would unfold. Of all the records Eddy Merckx pursued in his career, none carried quite the same mythic weight,
nor extracted quite the same physical toll as the world hour record. The challenge is deceptively simple in its description: a single rider, alone on a velodrome track, attempting to cover the greatest possible distance in exactly 60 minutes, with no drafting, no team support, no tactical relief. Just one body against the relentless, unforgiving math of speed and time. Merckx made his attempt in October 1972, in Mexico City, a location chosen deliberately for its high altitude, where thinner air offers reduced aerodynamic resistance, allowing a rider to theoretically achieve higher speeds for the same physical effort. But altitude comes with its own brutal cost. Reduced oxygen availability makes the cardiovascular demand of an all-out effort even more punishing than it would be at sea level. What followed has become one of the most quietly harrowing stories in cycling history. Merckx pushed himself through the full 60 minutes at a pace so extreme, so completely without reserve,
that by the end of the attempt he had to be helped off his bicycle. Those present described him as utterly spent, physically devastated in a way that went beyond ordinary post-race exhaustion. He had set a new world record, 49,431 kilometers, a mark so demanding that it would stand for years before eventually being broken, and it remains even decades later.
regarded by many inside the sport as perhaps the purest, most complete physical effort of his career. Merckx later described the hour record as by far the hardest effort of his life, saying he would never again attempt anything like it. This is worth sitting with for a moment. A man who had already survived a fatal crash that killed the rider beside him, who raced through years of chronic back and hip pain, who had endured public accusations of doping and the crushing psychological weight of being the man every rival organized their entire race around. This same man identified a solitary hour on a wooden velodrome track, with no one to compete against but the clock itself as the single most punishing experience of his entire career. There is something deeply revealing in that admission. Every other race Merckx won involved rivals to outmaneuver, tactics to deploy, moments of relative recovery hidden within the larger effort of a multi-hour race. The hour record offered none of that mercy. It was simply pain, sustained and unbroken, for 60 uninterrupted minutes, with absolutely no strategic escape from the suffering.
In choosing to attempt it, and in pushing himself to the point of needing assistance simply to stand afterward, Merckx revealed something essential about the psychology that had carried him to every other victory of his career, an almost frightening willingness to empty himself completely, with no reservation held back for tomorrow.
The record he set in Mexico City became, for a generation of cyclists who followed him, a kind of sacred and slightly terrifying benchmark, a distance that represented not just athletic achievement, but a level of self-inflicted suffering that many riders quietly admitted they were not certain they had the will to replicate.
It took the sport years to find a rider willing to even attempt to break it. By 1975, Eddy Merckx had already won the Tour de France 5 times in his previous 5 participations, tying the record for most victories in the race's history. A 6th win would have made him the sole record holder, an achievement that seemed, given everything the cycling world had already witnessed from him,
almost inevitable. He arrived at the race that year having already won 4 major spring classics, and despite admitting he had not felt entirely at his best heading into the Tour, he took the yellow jersey by winning the time trial on stage 6 and carried it deep into the race. Then came stage 14, a mountain stage finishing atop the volcanic peak of the Puy d'Dôme in central France, a climb notorious for its brutal, unrelenting steepness and for the massive crowds that packed its narrow roads shoulder to shoulder with the riders.
Merckx, still in yellow, was making his way up through the throng of spectators, closing in on a rival named Joop Zoetemelk, when a local man from Clermont-Ferrand named Nello Breton stepped out from the crowd and punched Merckx directly in the stomach, in the area of his kidney. The blow knocked the wind out of him.
Merckx would later describe struggling for a long time afterwards simply to catch his breath. He finished the stage still in visible distress, and while he somehow managed to hold on to the yellow jersey that day, something in the race, and perhaps in him, had shifted. Merckx himself later claimed that the assault, and the effects of medication he took afterward to manage the pain from it, contributed directly to a collapse he suffered days later on the brutal climb to Praux-Loup, where French rider Bernard Fenet launched a series of relentless attacks that Merckx, for the first time in years, could not answer. It was on the mountain of Praux-Loup and the following day on the Col d'Azur that Bernard Fenet finally dethroned the cannibal, taking the yellow jersey Merckx had defended for so many years and riding on to become France's first Tour de France champion in a decade. Merckx never wore the yellow jersey again in his career. He finished that 1975 tour in second place, a result that would have been considered a triumph for almost any other rider in history, but which, for Merckx,
represented something the cycling world had never truly seen from him before. Defeat delivered not purely by a superior rival, but shadowed by the shocking violence of a stranger's fist. What almost never gets discussed honestly in retellings of this story is how strange and unresolved the incident remained. Nello Breton was never seriously punished.
The assault occurred in full view of enormous crowds, yet in the chaos of a mountain stage, with riders and spectators pressed together on narrow roads. There was little practical way to prevent it or fully hold anyone accountable in the moment. Merckx was left to carry both the physical consequences and the psychological weight of having his greatest ambition, a record 6th Tour victory, potentially stolen from him not on the road, but by the crowd itself. Cycling historians still debate how much the punch actually altered the outcome of that tour, and how much of Merckx's decline that July was simply the natural, inevitable erosion of a body that had spent a decade riding through the aftermath of Blois. Perhaps both truths coexist. What is certain is that the Puy de Mai became, symbolically and literally, the mountain where the cannibals' reign over the Tour de France came to an end, not with a whimper, but with a moment of shocking, senseless violence that no amount of talent or willpower could have prepared him for. The years following 1975 were not a sudden collapse but a slow, painful decline. The kind that is often harder to watch than a dramatic ending, because it unfolds in increments. Each one a small, quiet negotiation between a champion's pride and his body's diminishing capacity to answer for it. Merckx continued to race through 1976 and 1977, still capable of moments that reminded the world of what he had once been, but no longer the rider who could simply decide to win and then do it. The accumulated toll of everything, the Blois crash and the chronic hip and back pain it had left behind, the physical devastation of the 1972-hour record, the psychological weight of the Puy de Dôme assault, and simply the sheer, relentless volume of racing he had subjected his body to across more than a decade at the sport's highest level had finally caught up with him. This is in many ways the part of Merckx's story that is hardest to tell with the same triumphant energy as the years of total dominance. And perhaps that is exactly why it tends to get compressed into a single sentence in most retellings. He got older.
He slowed down. He retired. The reality was far more human and far more painful than that. In May 1978, on the advice of his doctor, Eddy Merckx announced his retirement from professional cycling. He was 32 years old, not old by the standards of ordinary life, but ancient by the standards of a sport that had already demanded more from his body than most athletes could survive giving.
The retirement was not framed as a triumphant final chapter, a farewell tour built around one last glorious victory. It was framed honestly as a medical necessity, a body that had finally reached the absolute limit of what it could endure, advised by a doctor to stop before the damage became irreversible. Across a professional career stretching from 1965 to 1978, Merckx had recorded 445 victories in 1,585 professional races, a win rate that, spread across such an enormous volume of competition, remains almost incomprehensible by modern standards. When his amateur victories are added to the total, his lifetime win count climbs past 525. No rider before him, and arguably none since, has combined that volume of competition with that density of victory. There is a particular kind of grief that belongs uniquely to athletes at the moment of retirement, not the grief of loss in the ordinary sense, but the grief of watching a version of yourself that no longer exists, a body that used to answer every demand you placed on it and now simply cannot. Merckx, by his own later reflections,
insisted he carried no regrets about the decision or about the career that preceded it. Given everything he had won, he said, what regrets could there possibly be? But the phrasing itself, the need to state explicitly that he had no regrets, hints at the complicated emotional reality that so often sits beneath the surface of a legend's own retelling of his story.
Walking away from the only life he had known since he was a teenager, at 32, with a body permanently altered by a crash that had killed another man, was never going to be a simple or painless goodbye, however he chose to frame it publicly. Retirement did not mean Eddy Merckx disappeared from cycling. In 1980, he founded Eddy Merckx Cycles, a bicycle manufacturing company that would go on to supply bikes to professional teams across multiple decades, eventually distributing to more than 25 countries. He remained CEO of the company until 2008, staying connected to the brand even afterward. It was, in its own way, a continuation of the same relentless attention to detail that had defined his career. The same man who once obsessively adjusted his saddle in the middle of a race, chasing relief from pain that Bloss had left behind, was now spending decades designing the bicycles other riders would race on. He also stayed deeply involved in the administrative side of the sport, managing the Belgian national team at the World Championships between 1986 and 1996.
And later helping organize professional stage races, including the Tour of Qatar and the Tour of Oman. The man who had once been the most feared rider in the peloton became, in his later years, one of the sport's most respected institutional figures, a quiet, steady presence rather than the ferocious competitor the world had once known.
Perhaps the most human thread running through the second half of Merckx's life is his family. His son Axel Merckx became a professional cyclist himself in the 1990s, racing in the shadow of a surname that carried impossible expectations. Axel built a respectable career of his own, including a stage win at the Giro d'Italia in 2000. And it says something meaningful about Eddy Merckx as a father that he supported his son's career with genuine pride rather than trying to relive his own glory through him. When American rider Lance Armstrong, during his own dominant run in the Tour de France, found himself racing directly against Axel Merckx, it reportedly created one of the very few moments of real tension in Eddy Merckx's otherwise warm friendship with Armstrong. A small telling detail about where his loyalties, even decades after his own retirement, truly lived.
Even into his later decades, Merckx remained a towering figure in Belgium and across much of cycling-obsessed Europe. Fans lined up for hours just for the chance at an autograph, decades after his final race.
He continued riding a bicycle regularly, even as an older man, a habit that speaks to something simple and sincere beneath all the records and the nicknames. He had never stopped loving the thing that had defined his life, despite everything it had cost him physically. The truth about Eddy Merckx that rarely gets told in full is not a story of a man who simply won more than anyone else. It is the story of a boy who chose a hard, uncertain life despite having a comfortable, safer path available to him. It is the story of a young champion nearly broken by a doping scandal he always insisted was unjust. It is the story of a man who survived a crash that killed the person riding beside him, and who then spent the rest of his career racing through pain that never fully went away. It is the story of an assault by a stranger's fist on a French mountainside that may have cost him a record that would have stood alone in cycling history. And it is finally the story of a father, a business owner, an old man still climbing onto a bicycle simply because he could not imagine a version of himself that did not. They called him the Cannibal because he could not stand to let anyone else win. What the nickname never captured, and what his full story finally reveals, is how much that hunger cost him, and how quietly for more than 50 years, he carried that cost without ever once asking the world to feel sorry for him.